any others online? Neighbor? No? Okay. All right. If we're live, are we live online? Okay. Thank you. I'd like to call to order this meeting of the Elections Committee of the House on February the 1st, 2022. And we will begin with a request for bill introductions. Do we have any introductions to be presented to the committee? Yes, ma'am. If you come and give your name and...
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Committee. This is Representative Mary Lynn Poskin, and I would like to request that the Elections Committee introduce 22 RS 2431. It amends KSA 25-2407 and requires attribution on political ads in school board and community college trustee races in Kansas. Currently, these are required in USD 259 only, and this would make the requirement consistent across school boards and apply it to the community college trustee races as well. Thank you.
What's that number again? Sorry.
You bet. 22 RS 2431.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Without objection, the bill will be introduced. Anyone objection? Okay. Are there any other bills to be introduced? Yes, sir. Representative Miller.
I don't have one, but I was alerted by Representative Susan Ruiz that she had a request if we could leave the subject open if she shows up. I know she had a committee to go to as well. If she shows, could we reopen the subject?
If there's no objection, we'll return to introduction of bills if she makes it to this meeting. But continuing, is there any other bills to be introduced at this time? All right. Just for information purposes, the election committee will meet on Thursday, Lord willing, and the snow don't rise, February the 3rd to introduce bills, and that's the last day for non-exempt committees can request bill drafts. Is actually February the 7th, which is a non-meeting day. So this Thursday will be our last opportunity in our regular meeting. Okay. And once again, Representative Ruiz will be recognized if she attends. Okay, next, if you've reviewed the rules for the committee and the contrary rules, I would entertain a motion to approve. Been moved by Vice Chair, seconded by Representative Proctor. All right, for discussion? Okay. If not, all in favor, please say aye. Aye. All opposed? Abstain? And those are passed. Those are our rules for the year. And only thing we have on the agenda besides a possible other bill introduction is Mr. Mark Skoglund, Executive Director of Government Ethics Commission, and to make a general presentation of ethics and whatever he chooses to present to us today. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, my name is Mark Skoglund. I'm the Director of the Governmental Ethics Commission and always glad to be in front of House elections. You get to see a lot of me, and I appreciate every opportunity I can to interact with you. Today, I'm here to talk about our 2021 annual report, which is essentially a summary of everything that the Commission engaged in, and mostly we're talking about fiscal year 2021, which means that those of you looking for the exciting graphs about campaign finance from the 2020 election, it's in this particular annual report. It's all the way in the back. So if there's something I'm talking about that you're not directly as interested in, I promise, flip to the back of the report, and there's some interesting stuff back there to look at as well. So first, however, I do want to talk very briefly about our mission, which we have written up on page 1. We exist really to foster public trust in governmental decision-making. And that really is two parts. We're not just about preventing actual corruption, but public trust is all about preventing the appearance of corruption as well. So there are some portions of the gift laws, for example, where people might say, well, this doesn't seem like something that would actually influence someone's behavior. And that's probably true, but the public may perceive it that way. So the laws are written with both factors in mind, and they are equally important. Now, we prioritize education and prevention of issues. We really don't try to fine people unless there's no other avenue. If an issue is severe or intentional, then we talk about fines. But generally speaking, those of you who have worked with us before, you know we're really just trying to help you make sure that we're correcting errors and fixing them when they come up. I'm very lucky to have the staff that I do with great amounts of experience, and I really appreciate everything that they do. Now, I'm going to flip over to page 6 just very briefly to talk about our trainings. Now, I know that we do most of our trainings in person, that we're working on an electronic rollout that would be accessible to all state employees. But right now, we do all of our trainings in person. And we thought that our trainings would actually take a decrease during the pandemic, but they really haven't. We've been right around, we did 11 in fiscal year 21, and that's been about on target to the number of trainings that we conduct. We are going to switch and start reporting the number of people we are training, which I think is a much more useful number going forward in future annual reports. On page 7, we talk about advisory opinions. Now, normally we have a lot of people who submit requests for advisory opinions during the year, and we typically will produce around 6 to 8 advisory opinions in a year. But for whatever reason, whether people were very focused on campaigns or there just weren't questions that people wanted formal advice on other than the informal advice that we give all the time, only one opinion was actually issued during fiscal year 21, which was very odd and a distinct outlier. Actually, that opinion wasn't even one that was requested of the commission. It's one that we produced. It's the one that says that if you have a text message from your campaign that has express advocacy that you have paid for, so you've paid someone to produce those texts, you have to have a paid for at the beginning of the text. So that's the opinion that we produced in fiscal year 21. So formal opinions, generally speaking, we didn't have a lot of requests for those. On campaign finance on page 8, this is where things, we go from having one advisory opinion to we see really what my staff has been very engaged in. In fiscal year 2021, 3,336 campaign finance reports were filed. And of those, every single one of those reports and every line on those reports received a comprehensive desk review, making sure that they are all in compliance and we are helping people ensure that they are compliant with the Campaign Finance Act. There were 83 Senate candidates that ran, raising just over $8 million. And the largest percentage of that came from individuals, which was just about 38%. PACs were the second largest source at 23%. That's pretty typical for the Senate, that individuals would be the largest single source of contributions. In the House, there were 258 state House candidates, and they raised just shy of $7 million in the 2020 cycle, with the largest source being individuals, which was 33%, PACs being the second most at 26%. This is a little bit different than historical. The normal House, in a normal year, and I'll show you a chart at the end that shows this as well, generally speaking, the largest single source for donations on the House side is typically PACs. But this last cycle, for the first time in 20 years, was individuals. Individuals were, for whatever reason, very motivated to provide contributions to campaigns in the 2020 cycle. It's pretty normal in both the Senate and the House. The largest... Mr.
Skoglund, I'm just going to interrupt just enough to welcome Representative Neighbor to the meeting online. Thank you.
As is pretty typical in both the Senate and the House, the largest single expense was printing and distribution of campaign literature, which was between 30 and 35% of what people spent their campaign funds on. On page 9, you see audits. There's a number of reasons why an audit might be triggered. We typically do them to help candidates, and we did 3 campaign finance audits that were comprehensive in fiscal year 2021. Of those 3,336 reports that were issued, you see in that box, there's a little bit of statistics as well. We sent 227 failure to file notices and 603 error and omission notices. So a lot of errors that needed to get fixed, but we definitely worked with people to try to correct those errors when they arose. On page 10, obviously all of you know about filing statement of substantial interest forms, but in addition to candidates for office, there were state employees are also very frequently have to file SSIs, and there were in total 5,744 SSIs that were filed in fiscal year 21. On page 11, you see a little quick look at our lobbying regulation. In calendar year 2021, 573 lobbyists were registered, which is a little bit of an increase from 2020, but not too far outside of the norm. What I think was very interesting, however, is that in calendar, up until the January report was filed, lobbyists only expended $332,000 on lobbying activities. Now, normally, a normal lobbying year is between $1 and $1.2 million in Kansas. $332,000 is drastically below the norm, and actually is even below the fiscal year 2020 or calendar year 2020. So it's interesting that that is a significant departure from the norm as well. 4,757 lobbyist reports were filed, and of those, we only sent 75 failure to files. We were, thanks a lot to the work of Jessica White, as well as having a lobbying consumer base in this state that mostly tries to be very compliant. That's only 1.5% of lobbyists that received a failure to file. On page 12, you see a little bit about our enforcement. We addressed about 21 investigations in fiscal year 21, and of that, there were 25 complaints that were filed. 15 complaints were dismissed because there wasn't evidence to support a probable cause determination. 8 complaints had a public hearing, and 2 of those complaints are still ongoing today. On civil penalties, down there at the bottom, civil penalties are assessed automatically. Hopefully none of you have had to deal with them, but they're assessed automatically by statute if a report is filed late. And we can always waive civil penalties for good cause, which can mean any number of different things. Obviously, there have been a lot of people requesting civil penalty waivers for COVID-related reasons, as well as people changing jobs, a number of issues. Everyone has unique circumstances, and the commission always takes them into consideration. In fiscal year 21, the commission assessed $52,000 in civil penalties, and just under $15,000 of that ended up being waived. Page 13 is a quick look at civil fines, which only are assessed if a serious or intentional violation has occurred. Civil fines in the amount of $48,640 were ultimately assessed as a result of 8 civil fine hearings, and of that, $14,800 of that was waived, primarily due to the commission often structures a fine as that if it is paid and they are fully compliant within a certain time period of the hearing, then they will reduce the fine by a substantial amount. A large portion of that $14,800 was one waiver for $12,500. So before I do legislative recommendations, I'm actually going to skip back to the charts in the back just very briefly. On page 20, there's that statistical comparison of lobbying expenditures. I made a note of this already, but just if you wanted to see just how drastically it was lobbying expenditures were down in 2021, it's just interesting, I think, to look at that side by side over the last decade. And then on page 33, actually, let me find the other page for you instead. 33 is the Senate, and in here, we should look at the House. Page 27 is the 20-year comparison of House monetary contributions. That red line along is PACs that made contributions to campaigns, and the gray line is individuals. And you'll see over 20 years, it's very consistent. The most and the second most source of contributions has always been PACs and then individuals. But for the House, in 2020, the individuals were significantly increased, far beyond anything that we had seen in the last 20 years, and created a scenario where individuals were the largest single source of contributions. Now, before I do commission recommendations, which start on page 14, I'm happy to take any questions or if there's anything that I can provide at this time.
Any questions, committee? Online? Representative Lee.
Thanks, Mark. What's mass media on page 20? That's significantly lower. So what is it actually?
Right, so there are, when lobbyists provide their reports, they have to categorize their expenses. Mass media is typically when they're producing some sort of advertisement about an issue. And so that is, you're right, that is definitely one of the areas that went down rather significantly. It's also worth noting that that went down quite a bit last year as well in 2020. Normally, that number is over $100,000, and it just hasn't been the case lately. It might be simply because lobbyists are shifting where they prioritize their funds, or it could be any number of other issues. But yes, that category is one where is a significant decrease as well. Food and beverage also went down in both years, but I think that a large portion of that is probably attributable to the pandemic, I would imagine.
Representative Doppler.
Back to the 20-year comparison, you showed the gray line on the individuals as opposed to the red line on the PACs on page 27. That's House, specifically for the House. And how much of that spike would you say could be attributed to funds raised from the Act Blue, the online Act Blue?
Sure. So we don't have that breakdown in terms of what payment processor or fundraising source that went through. We don't parse the data in that particular way, but I'm sure that to the extent that that is reported through those particular payment processors, we can parse some data for you for that. Normally, when we see a payment processor like ActBlue, WinRed, or any of the other similar entities, we don't see that processor, we see the contributions being reported. And then we see an amount that's being paid to those processors for an amount that the processor obviously takes for their processing fee.
Sorry, one follow-up to that. So I've noticed that the Act Blue contributions seems like they're about 90-some% individual contribution. Sorry, that's why I brought that up. Thanks.
So Mark, just as a point of information for me, can you talk to me about how the functionality of a PAC works? Obviously, the individuals are capped, and then businesses can't contribute once session starts. How do the PACs work? I mean, are you able to how much is an individual able to donate to the PAC? Sorry, can you just break down the functionality of how a PAC works?
Sure, of course. So a PAC can raise as much money as it wants. A PAC, by definition, is any group of 2 or more individuals that has a major purpose to expressly advocate for a candidate for office or to make expenditures or contributions to candidates for office. The PACs fall into an area of the Campaign Finance Act where a lot of times they are reporting either direct contributions to candidates or they're reporting their independent expenditures that they make for candidates that they don't coordinate with. So PACs range rather dramatically from very small PACs that are just a few people that are working towards a particular issue, and so they support candidates as a major purpose related to that, to very large PACs that obviously conduct quite a bit of campaign advocacy as well. So it's a pretty wide range on PACs, and the registration is different depending on their activity.
So how much can people donate to a PAC? I mean, I've heard it said that this is a way that people can donate more to a campaign than actually they're able to donate via normal campaign finance laws. Is that true? Is it like, how much can I donate to a PAC? Is it $5,000, $1,000? Because it's what, $500 to just an individual candidate, correct?
So for an individual House candidate, it is correct that it is $500 in the primary, another $500 in the general. A PAC doesn't have those limits, but a PAC can only give $500 to a candidate in the primary and $500 in the general. Now, they can go out and do independent expenditures in any amount that they want, as long as they're reporting what they're doing, and as long as they aren't coordinating or with a candidate. So if a candidate is not consenting to an expenditure, is not providing information, isn't sharing a vendor, any sort of things like that, if they're not coordinating with that candidate, then they are considered independent expenditures. The candidate may or may not actually want the PAC to go out and be doing some of that activity. We've had instances where candidates will call us and say, this PAC is putting out this ad. I don't like this ad. I don't like this messaging. Is there something I can do about it? And we say, no, that's the point of an independent expenditure. They can do what they want, and that's why it's not limited. But they do have to report the dates that they are making those independent expenditures, the vendors they are using, and the amounts that they are expending. So, and the candidates that are benefiting. So you see all of that broken down in a PAC report.
Got it. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the privilege of asking these questions. I won in a special election, and so I've not quite had to go through all of this process. So thank you for breaking that down for me. I appreciate that.
Oh, fundraising is a fun beast. I'm sure everyone really enjoys that part of that campaigning.
Next, Representative Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I have a question, but first, and I've said this before, but I always kind of have a little panic attack when I open up my mailbox and there's a letter from your commission. But anyway, back to the gray line on the chart here, and there's also a yellow line for out-of-state. So would out-of-state individuals be on the gray line, or would they be counted on the yellow line?
So out-of-state is actually out-of-state businesses. They're any business that was contributing that has a listed domicile as being out-of-state. So you see businesses actually broken down into two lines. You have the yellow out-of-state, and then you also have the lighter blue business line. The lighter blue business line, that's all businesses inside Kansas. The out-of-state, the yellow line, is businesses that come from outside of the state.
Okay.
Individuals are all in.
Interesting to see how many out-of-state individuals, but anyway, thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Proctor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'd like to ask, we had a bill introduction today about local elections. I know that like for cities of the first class, it's kept at the county clerk. What is your interaction or involvement in municipal campaigns and campaign finance?
It's a great question. We had a tweet thread about it trying to explain it when we were getting flooded with questions about school board races, so I definitely appreciate the opportunity to talk about that here. So we have jurisdiction, direct jurisdiction, including they're subject to the Campaign Finance Act. We enforce the law for these particular races for anything down to cities of the first class, boards of public utilities, and then school boards with a regularly enrolled student body of over 35,000, which currently is one school district in the state. It's just Wichita. So it's just USD 259. All other school boards, as second-class cities, third-class cities, they do have campaign finance obligations that are spelled out in the law, but we don't have any enforcement, we don't have any interaction with it. The Campaign Finance Act does not apply to those races. They just have some reporting obligations that happen a little bit less often, and the enforcement is up to a district attorney or county prosecutor to enforce, rather than our office dealing with any issues that might arise.
Yes, sir.
But I want to make sure I understood what you said. For school board races, except for that one school district, there's absolutely no requirements for reporting right now.
There is a reporting requirement, but the Campaign Finance Act does not apply. So there's a lot of limitations on what campaign funds can and can't be used for, how much people can raise, things like that. None of that applies to those races outside of our jurisdiction. Obviously, a locality could choose to pass laws that apply to those races, or the legislature could choose to pass laws about those races if they wanted to. But realistically, that is right now not subject to those restrictions that we talk about applying to every other race. So because we have no jurisdictional authority and the Campaign Finance Act does not apply to those races, they just have the reporting obligations that are just spelled out in really one statute, which is 25904.
So for those races that you do have jurisdiction over, how much interaction do you actually have with those, and how much of it is done at the county level?
So for the ones that we interact with, reports are turned in at the county level still, but they're sent just like all of you turn in your reports to the Secretary of State's office, and then we deal with the enforcement side where we make sure that we're helping you come into compliance. If there's an issue that comes up, we help you fix it. It's the exact same relationship that we have with county clerks. Jennifer Schneider is our local campaign finance coordinator, and she gets to work with every county clerk in the state, and she knows them all. And so I definitely am very lucky to have her on staff because the amount of work that she does, making sure that she's working very closely with all those county clerks is truly incredible.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This may predate you, so you may not be able to answer the question. Do you know the history as to why we file our campaign finance statements with the Secretary of State instead of your office? Because it would seem to me you would be the more logical place to file those, since you're the one, they don't do anything with it, they just accept them, but you're the one that scrutinizes them and follows up. So why do you know?
I do, and there's actually two parts to this answer. The first that is a lot quicker, so I'll say that part first. It is generally the case nationwide that in most states, campaign finance reports are turned in with Secretary of State's offices and then enforced through some sort of ethics commission or campaign finance agency of some sort. There are a few states where that's not the case, but they're definitely the minority. Now, the historical reason why is because the commission came about in 1974, and some version of campaign finance has existed for a large portion of the 1900s. So that all passed through the Secretary of State's office long before we existed. The Ethics Commission came about as somewhere around Watergate. I mean, most ethics commissions nationwide occurred post-Watergate. The filing of campaign finance long predated that the existence of our agency. And so that's partly the reason. It's also partly the reason we have 8.5 employees and no dedicated IT staff. So we definitely appreciate getting to work with the Secretary of State's office. They are great over there for us to work with. Their IT staff, whenever we have some sort of an issue, or we're actually upgrading our database right now, and we've been talking to them. They've been extremely helpful in that process for us as well.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, we might want to find out on the other side of the coin as to how many staffers the Secretary of State has to handle this subject before we had any discussion about whether it should be moved. But my thinking goes back to the question Representative Toplicker raised earlier. I find searching the Secretary of State's site rather cumbersome in terms of, let's just use his example. If I wanted to find out who all and how much Act Blue had contributed to, I have to search every campaign finance report. When in this day and age, I ought to be able just to type in Act Blue and hit search and have them all pop up. So when I was thinking about what he asked, and I was remembering how hard and cumbersome it is, and another problem with them is if you don't know the exact name of the entity, you can't find them. But I don't know, I just wanted to throw that out, Mr. Chairman, for discussion and see if we couldn't all be collectively brainstorming on how this whole system might be made more logical and more user-friendly. And by the way, the answer that everybody else is doing it is one of the worst answers that I've accepted as an explanation. The other one is because that's the way we've always done it. Those two things just don't, I know I'm not criticizing you, I'm just saying if that's the only reason we do it is because everybody else does, and I think we need to think a little bit beyond the box. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
If the chair permits, I do have two responses as part of that as well. So the first that I would notice is as part of this database upgrade, we are hoping in the long run to have a different display of data on our website. Right now, you pull up full reports. It's just a different display of data than the Secretary of State has. Some people prefer our system. Some people prefer the Secretary of State's data display. Right now, it's just very different. And post overhaul, I anticipate that we'll have a little bit more accessibility, but it again will be a different display of data than the Secretary of State does. So those people who are used to and more comfortable with just looking up reports on the Secretary of State's website should still be using that. But there'll be a different way to look at reports eventually once our database is fully upgraded. The other thing that I will note is, right now I know this is a little bit in the weeds, but on an FEC report, if you pull up Act Blue, for example, you see all of those contributions coming in and then who the individual is. But on Kansas campaign finance reports, that's not the case. You don't see, all you see is there was this individual who made this contribution. You don't see this individual made this contribution through Act Blue or WinRed. What we do see is an expenditure that goes out to Act Blue or WinRed, that is the processing fee related to that contribution, but we don't actually see what processor was used for a specific dollar value. At least that's the typical case for our campaign finance reports, which is definitely different than you sometimes see on a federal report.
Yes, Representative Topiker.
When you see on a report that someone donated the maximum amount allowed, and then for their occupation, it will list unemployed, does that raise a red flag or flags to you that there may be, on some reports, over an election cycle, 5 to 10 of those? Does that raise red flags?
I will say the typical case when we see something like that is that the individual who is contributing the money is retired or otherwise, and they just simply indicated unemployed rather than retired when they submitted the contribution. That's not atypical, but there are a lot of things that can raise red flags in our review process. And like I said, for state reports in particular, Karina Renna gets to look at every line of those reports, and there's a number of things that we often will collaborate on when issues come up that seem odd for whatever reason. Most things that come up are pretty straightforward, but there's always new questions with every election cycle with some new oddity that shows up on a report, and we always talk about them to see the best way to resolve them.
Anyone else on the committee have questions for Mr. Skoglund? Okay. Is that the completion of your presentation?
I just have the legislative recommendations.
Okay, I appreciate that.
So the legislative recommendations begin on page 14. This year we only have 2 legislative recommendations, though that's a tiny bit misleading because the second one is a bunch of procedural cleanup items that I'll talk about. The reason why we're trying to limit it to these 2 is because we're really focusing on how important required electronic filing is for our office. Right now, statewide candidates have to file electronically through the Secretary of State's e-filing system. State candidates do not have to use that system. Now in the House, nearly 70% do, and in the Senate, 73% do use that e-filing system currently, but it's not required. Everyone else is submitting Excel spreadsheets directly to us or a handwritten document of some kind. That sort of thing is how a lot of people file their reports. Some people will even file it through fax. Now the problem is that when reports are being able to be submitted through these multiple avenues, it means that our process for processing these reports, every single line of those reports that we're processing, before we can even begin reviewing them for compliance, has to be hand entered into a database. Every line of all of those reports, which takes up to 3 months in an election year. So that's 3 months of staff time that is used just staring at a screen, typing data into that database so that we can then tell you what issues occurred and what we can fix. Now, in a state that requires electronic filing, like 42 states currently already do, it's something that is a lot more streamlined. We simply take the database of electronic filers and move it into our database, and we don't do any data entry other than the few people who still file by hand. Now, I will say, the concern when this original proposal came about nearly a decade ago, the biggest concern was that people who are in rural areas without access to reliable internet should not be barred from running for office, and I absolutely wholeheartedly agree with that concern. A few years ago, this committee, as part of this proposal, added to this that for-cause waivers should be given if anytime someone submits something to me and it provides some sort of good cause. So we can provide waivers to individual filers anytime someone lacks internet or any sort of other issue. For example, it could be anything from someone who just simply has an eye strain issue that prevents them from staring at a computer screen in the time it takes to enter a campaign finance report. Issues can be pretty broad, but being able to grant waivers for good cause resolves that issue. Now, I will say, obviously, the efficiency of processing reports is our biggest concern, but it's also a major issue for all of you. Those of you, I know Representative Collins mentioned just a moment ago that no one likes getting mail from our office, and we're pretty aware. When we put all that mail into the, sending it to candidates, we're aware that that shows up in mailbox and people panic when they see our name on it. We know where we stand. It's fine. What I will say, though, is that when people use the e-filing system, a lot of those errors are automatically fixed. You simply cannot enter a report with some of the errors that very commonly show up on those error and omission reports. So anytime that you want to reduce your E&Os that you get from our office, if you want to reduce the times that you have to go to your mailbox and see mail from us, use the e-filing system. It reduces it quite a bit. It doesn't solve everything by any stretch of the imagination, but it does resolve a lot of those errors. For us, not only does it increase our efficiency, but it also increases transparency. States that have an e-filing system are able to provide data to the public and to the people who are filing a lot faster, simply enough. For example, Oklahoma has a required e-filing system, and when they really the day after campaign finance filings are due, they're able to produce data. We can't do that until a month after the fact at the earliest. So it takes quite a bit of time for us to be able to process all of that information from reports. The other portion that I will note is I haven't heard this concern too much for this year, but if someone is concerned about changing the campaign finance filing rules right before the primary, because I know we're not that many months away from a primary at this point, the commission doesn't object if the legislature wants to delay implementation until say January 2023 or something like that. The commission does not recommend that specifically, but doesn't object to it if that does get added to the legislation. So that's the first legislative recommendation, is required electronic filing for state candidates. To be clear, does not apply to local candidates. It's just people running for state office, and it already applies to statewide candidates. They thankfully, because I can't even imagine trying to process those reams of paper if someone tried to handwrite a statewide campaign finance report. The second item, we're taking a page from the Secretary of State's idea last year when they had a procedural cleanup mega bill. We're doing much of the same. Our statutes really have had over the years, as certain statutes have been revised, a number of errors have come up. We're just looking to fix all of them. I don't think any of these are particularly objectionable in terms of how they operate. They don't change a lot about how we interact with the law or how our office functions, but what they do is they fix some of the text in the law. So you can see there's a number of parts here. The extraneous text on A, again, this just extra text that was left over from an amendment that happened a long time ago. Nothing really particularly difficult. The second one is the paid for law was written long before social media really existed. And right now, technically, paid for attribution has to appear at the end of an item. Facebook scrolls back chronologically forever, so there is no end of the page. So as a result, technically, it's impossible to comply with the paid for attribution statute on Facebook. This fixes that, so you just need to put the paid for somewhere that's clear and conspicuous. Easy enough. That's what a lot of states have started to head towards to address this exact issue. The third is a procedural issue where when we find probable cause to believe a complaint has merit, we have to set the hearing within 30 days. The problem is the commission doesn't meet every 30 days, just the way the calendar functions. Sometimes a meeting is 31 days, or sometimes a meeting can't occur for whatever reason, and it's 60 days out. So we're just changing those statutes from 30 days to 90 days, which still is quick, and the commission still intends to move as quickly as possible, but it makes sure that we don't run into a scenario where we have to set the hearing immediately and then reschedule it, which doesn't serve anyone's justice either. The fourth is a procedural consequence. When the statute for confidentiality was written, and we have a lot of value in that statute that we definitely don't want changed because we think it's extremely important to keep investigations confidential. There was a thought about state employees should be able to be solicited for advice about particular issues. It's their area of expertise. For example, if we had an investigation about a bank regulation, we should be able to talk to state bank regulators so they can give us the expertise that we definitely do not have. So anytime that we need to talk to a state employee, we can do that now so that we can gain their expertise as part of an investigation. statute left out federal employees, which probably was not an intended omission. This would just include that to make that a little easier. E is a statutory conflict. Affidavits can be filed now if you're not going to raise up to $1,000. If you're going to raise less than $1,000 and expend less than $1,000, you can file an affidavit and not file any campaign finance reports. There's a separate statute that if you exceed the affidavit, you have to go back and file all of your reports. The problem is that when that amount for the affidavit was raised to $1,000, the corresponding statute was not changed. So technically, the way the law functions, this is not the way we're enforcing it right now, but technically the way the law functions is that you can file an affidavit if you're going to raise and expend under $1,000, but if you raise and expend under just over 500, you have to go file those reports, which makes no sense at all. So we're fixing that statutory conflict. There's another extraneous text there, an F, that's simply left over. It refers to something that was repealed a long time ago. G is a requirement lobbyists all file electronically now since 2018. Technically, a couple lobbyists could file on paper. This fixes that oversight. There's a statutory conflict there on H as well that fixes the way that civil penalties begin being assessed for lobbyists. Again, that's the current practice of the commission, but it cleans up the law to meet the intention of the 2018 change that occurred. Now, I know that that's a lot to put into a mega bill. When we introduced our bills, they were split into Chapter 25 issues for campaign finance and Chapter 46 issues, which is lobbyist ethics, et cetera. We certainly don't object if the legislature wants to put them into one big mega bill and just handle it all at once. We really think that it's the same items throughout. It's a bunch of procedural issues that we think are important to fix, but realistically don't change our day-to-day. So that's our two legislative recommendations. That is very misleading to call two, but I'm still going to call it two legislative recommendations. And I can certainly take any questions if anyone has any.
Representative Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I would say to Representative Collins, you don't need to freak out until that mail comes certified.
I know a good attorney in case I need one.
As long as you can afford a good attorney. So what do we do, Mr. Chairman, in terms of getting these ideas into the hopper? I assume that you got your hand up, but I assume that we don't have RS numbers on these yet?
Mr. Hahn?
Actually, we do, but I didn't bring them today. I apologize for that, but...
Okay, I think we can do this without RS numbers, if I may, Mr. Chairman.
Well, I think maybe they've been introduced already.
Oh, they have?
That is correct, yes. We introduced them at the meeting last week.
Oh, we did. Now I remember. Remember reading that in the minutes. Okay, thank you. And I assume there are two bills, one with the electronic filing and the other with there's three because of two different chapters.
Correct.
Yeah, thank you.
The required electronic filing bill is exactly the same text as last year's bill, which is nearly the same text as the year before that, which is nearly the same text as the year before that. It's passed out of this committee 3 years running.
So we're in a position to recommend these favorably now?
Any other questions or comments, committee? Yes, Representative Dodson.
I wrote down two things for Representative Miller or whoever else is interested, RS 2642 and RS 2646 for the ethics cleanups.
And I imagine by now they have bill numbers.
And I believe 2836, I believe, was the House e-filing bill.
Do we know the bill numbers?
I don't offhand.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Representative Zoppiker and then Representative Lee.
How closely do you scrutinize the substantial interest statements, the conflict of interest statements that come from local cities and counties? How closely do you scrutinize those?
So local government SSIs are not filed with our office. We don't and for the most part, local entities that are filing those are typically candidates. There are some other people that do technically have to file local SSIs, but for the most part, we're talking about candidates for office.
Okay. But we do require under the law that these statements are filed, right?
Yes.
We do require them, especially, say, like people in counties, officials who appoint a study committee to determine who would get a contract. Say, like in Johnson County, we have contracts that can, in the last couple of years, several years can be over $300,000, and a committee of 3 might be appointed who are assistant department heads and that sort of thing. And I just wonder, they are required or not to file statements of substantial interest?
So there are two categories when we're talking about local government, when we're talking about SSIs that are filed at the local level. Primarily, the vast majority of SSIs filed at local government are people who are running for office. But there is another statute that does exist that essentially says that if someone who is a local employee is working on building a contract with an entity that they have a substantial interest in, they have to file that SSI at that time. So it's obviously at the state level, it's extremely comprehensive. Their SSIs have to be filed by anyone who is in a position where they are contracting, procuring, anything like that, which results in 5,700 SSIs being filed this last year.
So
Local
I
government,
guess
that's not the case.
the bottom line of my question is, does your office, are you charged with looking at those?
No, we are not.
And who is?
In terms of reviewing them, now at the state level, generally speaking, SSIs are used as part of an enforcement mechanism. So for example, if someone believes that someone has entered into a contract with an entity they have a substantial interest in, we first look to the SSI to see if they've disclosed that connection. If they haven't, then we might be talking about 2 violations rather than just 1. But they have to have disclosed that connection to that entity first and foremost. But yes, at the local level, I'm happy to have a pretty extended conversation with you. If you want, we can talk through how the local SSI law functions and how those end up being filed. But I'm happy to talk about different ways that we can approach that law as well.
Thank you.
Representative Lee and then Representative Proctor.
Thank you. So I think this is the same question or objection that I had last year, actually, to this electronic filing. I just was this morning in a hearing talking about election integrity and the power of the paper ballot. And so I'm a paper person versus electronic, although I understand it's really just a data collecting mechanism, right? I mean, that's the biggest benefit in terms of why you want this bill, is that so we can have the data right away. What is the downside of that? Because again, I represent rural folks. I think about some of those people and they would be intimidated I don't want that to be a deterrent for them not filing for office because they'd have to do it electronically. So is there any downside? I mean, is it going to be an issue to get those exemptions if they need an exemption to file electronically?
So there's 3 things I try to enumerate. It's the old high school debater in me. So first, when we're talking about integrity, now campaign finance filings are interesting in that all of that data is technically public. It's just a matter of when it becomes public. So we talk a lot of times about our database. We make sure it's secure. The Secretary of State's filing system operates under the same security that everything else in the office does as well, is my understanding. But campaign finance is interesting in that obviously no one can break into the system and change data, but ultimately we're talking about data that becomes public in the long run. So it's a little bit different when we're thinking about the security aspect to it. When we're talking about local people who are in rural areas who do not have reliable access to internet, I will tell you, I will tell you that when I came into this position, that was a concern that I shared on day one, that this is something that I think is something that we need to be concerned about. People who for whatever reason, cannot reasonably be expected to use a computer to file their reports, they should be able to gain a waiver. Most states who are recent adopters of required electronic filing have included a nearly identical waiver. Some states require an affidavit. I have no intention of requiring some sort of notary to request good cause to not have to file electronic reports. I will say that there, I don't know if you serve on the Ag Committee, but I know water reports are filed electronically by law as well. So I know some people are pretty used to that in some areas. I've heard of people driving over to libraries just to deal with their water reports. But for our purposes, we really would have no problem granting for-cause waivers. We would essentially just have, all that would be required is they'd have to submit some sort of writing that amounts to for cause. That's something that we could indicate is good cause. So it shouldn't be that difficult. And we're not, one day we may talk about a regulation to help spell out what that might be, but honestly, I'm not concerned about that. What I'm concerned about is making sure the exemption is built into the law and that we don't create a lot of barriers to accessing that.
And Representative Proctor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On this legislative, the item number F that you reviewed as your kind of wish list here for legislation, that kind of surprises me that that was ever a law. So I want to make sure I'm reading it right. There used to be a 30-day, basically, statute of limitations if you were going to catch somebody and, like, make a complaint about an ethics violation?
That was true of one specific subsection. It was referencing a different law. So essentially it was, I don't actually recall what that was because it's been repealed so long ago. But there was a specific violation that when it occurred, you had a 30-day window to register a complaint.
Okay.
That violation doesn't exist anymore. So there's no 30-day time period. In fact, there's no statute of limitations for any violation under our laws.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I just had a thought about some of the conversation we've had about the electronic filing, and that is that having filed a pretty good number of times for elections, that some people are concerned about not being able to know what their opponent activity was. And if it was filed timely in a handwritten form, it may be weeks before that can actually be entered into the system because of staff being able to, having to interpret the writing and to then do the recording, the computer recording or the electronic recording of the data themselves. And that's not beneath you, but it's at the same time, it's if it's not necessary or if it's plausible for the person to do it, I think it's a beneficial thing to request or to make a part of the format. And I appreciate Representative Lahan's comment about making sure that people don't feel uncomfortable with what they're not capable or don't feel comfortable doing. But at the same time, if they know that they can ask for a waiver, it still could reduce greatly the amount of delayed reports and have more openness to records rather than less. Okay, thank you. Just a thought. Some other, any questions or comments regarding?
I actually do, sorry.
Yes, ma'am.
Well, it's about the social media piece, and are we going to be talking about these bills later, or is this when we're talking about these bills for the social media piece?
I'm hoping I can take any questions about them now, of course. I do hope we have a hearing on our legislation, but
Okay.
I'm happy to take questions about them now if you'd like, or you can always email them to me as well. I'm happy to answer any questions people have.
With any of our bills, we're going to work towards a hearing for any of them that we're going to hear. We want to give opportunity for a presentation. So
Great, we can flesh it out then. Thank you.
okay, anyone else? Okay. Thank you, Mr. Skoglund, for your attendance and for your good report.
Thank you very much. I very much appreciate the opportunity to be here, and it's good seeing everyone again.
Thank you. And now for a little bit of announcement. You know, probably most of you have either seen on your email or on your phones that we are not going to be active in the House tomorrow, but we will be active on Thursday. We will have an agenda out to you, and an amended agenda if needed, but at least for this committee, at 3:30 on Thursday, we will meet to be able to give a final opportunity for bills to be submitted for us to receive. And if there's any other agenda items added, please watch your email to see what that would be, and we'll have that to you tomorrow. Okay? And anything else for the good of the committee? All right. We are adjourned.